There. Well, I'm Jeanne Schmitzer. I'm here in Cookeville, Tennessee. I hold a master's in history. I don't hold a PhD. I'm not a full-fledged expert or anything like that in US imperialism, but it is something that I have a lot of interest in, and I include a class on this where I teach as adjunct at Tennessee Tech, just one history class every semester. I've been doing that for about 11 years now. And I always include a section on this. So in the next 4 weeks, we're going to look at US imperialism at the turn of the 19th into the 20th centuries, and hopefully have some discussion that we'll all learn from, including me. So some of the things we're going to look at are, we're going to look at the influence of social Darwinism and the social gospel on our decisions to pursue imperialism and to get into the Spanish-American War. We're also going to look at how native people to the territories, how they were presented to the American public by the media and by educated academic specialists like anthropologists and scientists. And this helped to set the myths and stereotypes into the national mind. Third, we're going to look a little bit at the development of federal law in governing these places, governing the people in these places. We're also going to look at some Supreme Court cases that created constitutional precedents that really affected the lives of the native peoples in these territories. And lastly, we're also going to look a little bit at some similarities in how the Supreme Court viewed people in these territories and how that was similar to how they viewed to viewing Native Americans here in the United States. There's some real parallels with that. And for the most part, these are the same court justices that decided the Plessy versus Ferguson case that legitimized segregation in both law and culture. And a lot of this has to do with racial, a lot of racial undertones here. But if you're interested in reading a good, accessible book on this, that's easy to understand and follow and interesting, I put it in the chat. It's How to Hide an Empire: A History of the Greater United States by Daniel Immerwahr. It's a good book for a good overall that goes more even to up-to-date stuff. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here. We'll do a little bit of a, let's see. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Okay. Okay, so the first half of the 19th century, the country was still largely agricultural. Manufactured fertilizer hadn't been developed yet, but farmers needed it badly. And the best source for fertilizer was the Chincha Islands. They're off the coast of Peru. They're remote, they're rocky, they rarely had rain, but they overflowed with what they called at the time white gold, which is guano or bird poop. And it piled up like hundreds and hundreds of feet high over the centuries, you know. Well, the islands were controlled as British territory. And when the British brought the first ships of guano to the United States in the 1840s, I mean, it was just fantastic crop production. It was the cheapest, most powerful, portable fertilizer that we'd ever had. So farmers create this rabid demand And that encourages the British firms that pretty much monopolized this from the Chincha Islands. It drove the costs up. And we Americans don't like being commercially dependent on another's market and another's market control. So we were bound and determined, we're going to find guano resources elsewhere, preferably under our own control. So in 1856, this is just a couple of years after the Gadsden Purchase, Congress passes what's called the Guano Islands Act. And that act said, whenever a United States citizen discovered guano on an unclaimed, uninhabited island, that island could be considered as appertaining to the United States at the discretion of the president. And that word appertaining, it's kind of a legal word for a loose version of belonging to or connected to. It kind of reminds you of a very miniature scaled down version of the discovery doctrine. So when the bill passed in 1857, private American speculators, they sailed out like a land rush. They're looking for uninhabited islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. And 7 years later, by 1863, we had annexed 59 guano islands. And by 1901, it was a total of like 94 guano islands. All these places were very, very dry. They're like oceanic deserts or out in the middle of ocean deserts where there's very little rainfall, and that lets the guano collect and build for centuries. They're unlivable sites, but humans had to mine it, so you're living there, picking, blasting, tunneling, hauling it to the ships. So whoever is doing this, they're pretty much marooned there for months. All the supplies had to be shipped in, sometimes, a lot of times even fresh water. You're dependent on that. So the United States mostly used Hawaiian laborers and some Chinese. And in the Caribbean, we used some African Americans and some Afro-Caribbeans to do the work that was there. Well, this continued till manufactured fertilizers developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But what were particularly influential about this experience of claiming guano islands, it showed the United States that annexing remote island territory, that's a pretty good way to secure some sea stations, some safe harbors along the sea routes. Use them for coaling or fueling stations. It gives great trade access to other parts of the Pacific and Far East. It got us access to raw materials that we didn't have. So this is, we're seeing this. So the US is looking for opportunities to claim territories in both the Atlantic and the Pacific for way more than just guano and more than just uninhabited islands. And one empire that's got a lot of territories in both the Caribbean and the Pacific, it's conspicuously failing. Everybody knows it. The whole world knows that the Spanish Empire, she's on her way out. She's just not making it. And her colonial subjects in the Philippines and in Cuba, they are constantly revolting. They want their own independence. And it's pretty clear that they're slipping out of her control, and Spain's just not going to be able to hang on much longer. Well, many powerful people in the United States, especially politicians and corporations or big business owners, they see Spain's weakness as an opportunity to gain some of those territories for our own interests. Why don't we support some of these rebellions against Spain and then, kind of annex those territories in for their resources and cheap labor. Spain has already got, like the sugar industry, everything's already built and there and in place with cheap labor. So tonight we're going to talk about a couple of things that were extremely important or influential to the United States deciding to pursue imperialistic ventures. And the two things I really want to talk about are social Darwinism and the social gospel, because these were both some of the guiding principles behind our foreign policies, and also some of the principles guiding our domestic policies, believe it or not. It did a little bit of both. And we're going to talk about them in a minute. But to fully grasp social Darwinism and the social gospel, you got to kind of understand how the United States generally thought in terms of race at this particular period of time, at the turn of the century. What we thought about the country racially, how we saw the world racially. So we want to know, what were the accepted racial doctrines and notions that were held by our leaders, our political leaders, our religious leaders, our business leaders, those who are running our educational institutions, those legislators who are writing federal and state laws, the folks that are controlling our systems, our economic, political, military, and so on. How did they generally think in the terms of race? To understand how most of the nation thought at the time, you got to understand the term Anglo-Saxon as it meant at that time period in the late 19th century. So by the early 19th century, in both Victorian Britain and in the United States, the term Anglo-Saxon generally referred to what was believed to be a racially and spiritually superior group, white English-speaking Protestant people. If you descended from this stock, you belonged to the highest superior race. They were destined to progress. They're destined to move forward as a race intellectually, commercially, culturally, religiously. And in the United States, the general white mindset, it just accepted as an unchallenged fact that Anglo-Saxons had achieved the highest civilizations. They were innately gifted politically in the art of free or self-government. They attained the highest cultures, the most productive commerce, and the strongest military. All of this was believed to have been triumphed by the Anglo-Saxon people. Okay, well, by the 1840s, the perception was that the United States was distinctly an Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American power with this unique success story powered by that innate natural talent for free or self-government and commercial success. Okay, so this Anglo superiority was presumed to be the reason for our progress as a nation. Our progress was obvious, and there's divine evidence to it that the American Anglo-Saxon held natural superiority. We were a chosen people, just like the Puritans said. Our survival and prosperity from these little old destitute colonies, the miracle of our revolution against England, the greatest, power in the world, our Western expansion across the continent. So we've got our Puritan colonists, our revolutionary patriots, our creators of a superior government, our conquerors of the wilderness, our creators of immense material prosperity, commercial commerce and industry, opening raw materials of the West. All this we perceived as evidence of a superior people. No other race could have accomplished this. It was obvious the United States was blessed by God. Additionally, adding to this belief of a superior race was this flourishing scientific interest in race and scientifically classifying the races And this had been going on, from the 18th through the 19th centuries. So science is constructing different races. It's classifying and ranking them according to white perceptions, because it's whites that are creating the races. Whites were the scientists. They're the ones constructing the races. They were instructing the up and coming academic generations in universities across Europe and in the United States. Scientists and ethnologists were declaring the Caucasian race was a race above all others. It was innately meant to hold power, to successfully govern themselves, to develop commerce and industry. And you'll see this thread through here over and over. An innate talent for free government and commerce and industry. Those are just over and over. And then the religious part comes in there too. Okay. They're the race with all these natural abilities. So this so-called science of the races and the images that they put in people's minds had enormous effects on assumptions about white superiority, with ranges of concepts about non-white races. And it might be from just a feeling of slight superiority towards one race that's a little higher in the rankings, all the way down to just disgust of lower ranked races, sometimes to the point of being depicted as less evolved, nearly animal-like, and images and illustrations in the books, the magazines, the textbooks. They had a huge impact on how the United States, which identified as a white nation, how they looked at non-Anglos in our country and in the world as we went out into the world. But keep in mind that different anthropologists had all different racial groups and hierarchies. So one guy might say, well, there's 12 different races, another might have 5 different races, and they might rank their hierarchies differently. One might rank the Malay over the Chinese or vice versa. But the consistency in every single one of these hierarchies by every scientist always ranked the Caucasian or the Anglo-Saxon at the very pinnacle, at the top, and the African at the very bottom. Blacks, they're just uniformly depicted as incapable, inferior, primitive. You can't change. This is the way it is. And these ideas of superior and inferior racial destinies, this mindset, it had been built over a couple of centuries. This was already entrenched before the turn of the century here in the United States. Okay, so these racial ideas, they were a great underpinning to social Darwinism and to a degree to the social gospel. So let's start with social Darwinism. This is founded by a guy, he's an Englishman named Herbert Spencer. This about 1878 is when he comes up with this. And he took Charles Darwin's idea of the survival of the fittest and said, that stuff applies to both society and business as well. So in nature, there's this struggle to survive. And in that struggle, the weaker are weeded out. The more fit, they survive by natural selection. Well, that applies to people, said Spencer. Individuals compete to get to the top of the social ladder. And the fittest in society are the ones who make it. It's the natural order of things. Businesses compete against each other, and the biggest corporations are successful because they're the fittest, the strongest, the best. Standard Oil is the biggest, baddest corporation because it's the fittest. It's just the natural order of things. So that's social Darwinism. It equated monetary wealth and power with being the fittest in both corporate entities and in individual people. If a corporation was wealthy and powerful, or if a person was wealthy and powerful, it was simply because they were the fitter in the survival of the fittest in progress. And of course, all top successful nations were Anglo-Saxon. They're all Western European, basically. So the failure of others was the natural selection within, the social Darwinism thought. American Indians were failing in America, not because the country wasn't doing everything it could to assimilate them. It's that Indians were incapable of civilizing and assimilating into our society. Some are, but most aren't. Our Indian policies failed over and over because racially, they're incapable of, pulling this thing off. Mexicans, they're inherently unable and incompetent when it came to participating in our society. Asians were incapable of assimilating into our society. They can't share in our free government. They don't get it. These races weren't like us, and they're naturally relegated either to permanent subordination, always needing to be overseen, taken care of, or they could very well just become extinct, like the animals and the plants that can't survive the competition. And even within the white race, there are fit and unfit in the economic and social struggle. Not all whites rise to the top, but even the lowest whites believe that they're still part of the choicest select race. So social Darwinism reinforced racism, and it also endorsed this an elite racial mindset. And as we start expanding our holdings beyond our contiguous borders, we see non-white people and their governments in these places as having little power, little structure, little civilization, because they're innately weaker. They're innately less fit in the natural order of things. They can't help it. It's nature. Now, while social Darwinism is very strong, another philosophy develops here in the United States called the social gospel movement. And it's largely led by this Protestant clergyman, a guy named Josiah Strong. And the social gospel movement was actually part of the progressive movement, trying to solve a lot of the social problems and things brought about by urbanization and industrialization. But its solution was to apply Protestant religious principles to these problems. Well, Strong was also a strong believer in social Darwinism. To him, it made sense that Anglo-Saxons were the most fit of all the races. It's only natural that they lead all world affairs. It's a natural cycle. But Strong also believed something else that's really going to encourage him to really throw a lot of support towards imperialism. He believed that all other races and ethnic groups, even though they're less fit and less capable, they still needed the Protestant gospel to be civilized as best as they could be, to be uplifted, to be brought to Christ. And as the superior racial and religious group, Anglo-Saxons had the responsibility to civilize and Christianize these other peoples around the world. So therefore, he is very, very supportive of American imperialism to move into and take control of other places. We would gain resources we needed for our commerce, and at the same time, we'd be taking civilization and Christianity to these other places. Let me read you a quote by him where let's see. He's talking about the United States. Okay, this is what he says. It seems to me that God, with infinite wisdom and skill, is training the Anglo-Saxon for an hour sure to come in the world's future, the final competition of the races, for which the Anglo-Saxon is being schooled. Whether the extinction of inferior races seems sad or otherwise, it certainly appears probable. Okay. Well, this mindset, it justified us in taking lands from people believed to be less fit, exploiting both the people and the land for our commercial benefit. It justified our entire history of exploitation, death, destruction right here in the United States. It validated taking Indian land, destroying their civilizations, whether it was by massacre or benevolent assimilation and civilization or breached treaties or forced allotment or whatever. Slavery was over, but this sort of mindset supported the development of the South's lost myth, the lost cause myth. It validated our history as good for the slave. Later on, it's validating black codes and convict labor. It validates the Chinese Exclusion Act, the National Origins Act, things such as that. It validated our war against Mexico. We were intended to take huge territories from Indians, from Mexico, because it was fulfilling our manifest destiny. Accepting and taking this gift from God, we believe the whole continent was ours, given by God himself. Okay, we're meant to do this. And like Strong said, we're not dominating or taking from our equals. These folks aren't like us. We were meant to do the things we do for progress. I mean, it's divinely placed in our hands. So the 19th century is part of the age of imperialism for Western Europe, and especially for England. Imperialism is where a mother country, a larger, more powerful, more advanced country, establishes power and control over a smaller, lesser developed territory, all for the economic prosperity to the mother country, not for the territory where she's at. It's for the mother country in accessing raw materials, using the local people as cheap labor, for a good military position or for good trade position somewhere else in the world. So the commercial benefit, it's all about the mother country, not about the smaller territories. So powerful white countries are wielding themselves over less powerful non-white territories in order to benefit themselves of the raw materials and cheap labor. So many imperialists believe the ideas of Strong's social gospel, that people in these smaller territories, they benefited from Christianity and from being civilized in a superior Western culture. So driving American imperialism at the end of the 19th century is the fact that the United States transitions from this agricultural-based economy to an industrial-based economy. And this explosion of industry that constantly needs more sources of raw materials that we don't have here in this country, and also cheap labor, and there are many, many places in the world far less advanced that have a lot of stuff we need. And a lot of places also have a cheap labor pool. Okay, so Spain, Spain has holdings in the Caribbean, the Philippines. I think there's a couple in South America. France is in Africa and Southeast Asia. Germany's in Africa. Denmark and Belgium are in Africa. England was everywhere in Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, India, the Far East, the Pacific. England was everywhere, for Great Britain. Oh, I love this slide here. Hold on. Okay, this is a great slide. This is Cecil Rhodes. He's a British diamond merchant. De Boer's Diamonds. This is Cecil Rhodes. Anglo-Saxon, big businessman, supporter of British imperialism. And in this cartoon, he represents the power of Britain in controlling the African continent, north to south, from Cairo to Cape Town. Africa is theirs for the taking. And De Beers owned about 90% of the diamond market. Capital investment and imperialism, it just went hand in hand. Belgium, France, Germany, but mostly England. And listen to this quote by Cecil Rhodes. Sounds similar to something you just heard. Africa is still lying ready for us. It is our duty to take it. It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory. And we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honorable race the world possesses. Quote from Cecil Rhodes. So all these little colonial empires were for the benefit of the mother empire, little empires for the empire's sake, whether it's to tap minerals, for oil, for gold, diamonds, sugar, tea, rubber, cotton, coffee, whatever. And these resources were located in Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, the Caribbean, India, the Pacific. And because social Darwinism shaped how Western Europe and North America viewed the world, it really affected how these imperialist countries viewed the society and the people of the places they're moving into and controlling. This slide shows a schoolhouse, and the teacher there represents Great Britain. Okay, she's got all her little wild colonies all around her. It is chaos and mayhem. You got little kids playing games and tricks. Adults are fighting, childlike fighting. They're playing tricks on each other. They're incompetent. They're incapable of governing themselves. They need a fitter, stronger country to oversee them, to govern them, to civilize them, to bring them to Christianity. And if the United States got in this game, we could further penetrate on out into the world, just like all these European colonies. We could get up there with the big boys. We could get greater economic growth, while at the same time bringing these places stable government, civilization, and Christianity to these less fit, childlike people. So our expansion and prosperity for us would transform into bettering their lives, with Christianity and civilization. It's a win-win situation, is how it's kind of perceived. So conquering other places in the world, it's the right thing to do. Basically what we did, we applied social Darwinism to foreign affairs. Our 19th century foreign policy expansion was really set forth in racial arguments when it comes right down to it. Okay, next, as far as applying the social gospel, these imperialist countries, they sent in thousands of missionaries to try and civilize and Christianize the indigenous people at these places. They went to work eliminating the savageness of their cultures and religions, morally uplifting them through Christianity. And inevitably, this is the first step to wiping out a lot of these cultures and even tribes, whole groups of people. But it's the natural cycle. It's the survival of the fittest, just as with the American Indians, submit to be civilized, act like us, talk like us, believe, worship like us, dress like us, work like us, show you're the most fit of the American Indian race and you'll survive. You know, you can't entirely run your own affairs because you don't have the mental capacity. Therefore, you know, we'll handle that. We'll take care of all your affairs for you know, for your best interest until you're assimilated in and, you know, basically you'll no longer exist as a separate entity. But in this one, of course, we see Uncle Sam, and the caption is, "You've seen what my sons can do in war. Now see what my daughters can do in peace." So do y'all see what's going on in this cartoon here? And also, this is the Philippine Islands that we're looking at. Okay, who's leaving? Who's leaving the island?
The soldiers.
Oh yeah, we just whooped somebody's ass. And now who's coming in?
Missionaries.
Yeah, with Bibles and with books. We've got teachers, somebody with some cooking materials. Yes, the daughters are moving in to civilize these folks. So really, that's about all I've got for tonight. And what we'll do next week, I hate to start into something that we might not be able to finish. So next week, we'll look at the United States expanding outside our borders as we're looking for things like tropical foods, tropical fruits, sugar, rubber, you know, things that are going to further our status and our economy and give us this global presence. All of Europe already has it. And, you know, we want to be up with the Joneses. Okay, did I just stop sharing my screen? I didn't do that.
I did it.
Oh, okay.
I did it, yes.
Okay. All right.
Seemed like you weren't using it anymore.
No, I was done with it. Okay, so do y'all have any questions? What do you want to talk about? What hit you? What could you add? What did you put together?
Well, you know, there's still missionaries doing the same thing.
Yep.
In modern times, you know.
Oh yeah.
How is that the same and how is that different?
I know. I think
it seems to be the same thing, you know.
Mhm.
You know, basically, well, basically something that's disrespectful of, you know, of other cultures.
And you know, sometimes I think it's just not. It's still there. It's just way more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and to the point that people could even deny that they really do feel that way, but they really do. And even these folks thought they were doing a good thing.
Yeah. I think there are still people that don't realize some of the prejudice that they hold in their mind is from the social gospel, the social Darwinism. You know, they don't realize that what they believe, like some people still believe this shit on like a much small, like, you know, on a smaller level.
On a smaller level.
It's more subtle, but they don't realize that like it's bunk, you know.
And you know, too, I mean, this stuff was just entrenched. This was just accepted. And that stuff doesn't just die. You know, it doesn't just go away. And I think what you're seeing and referring to, you know, are the legacies, the results of that are still with us.
Yeah, isn't that also like the onset of, well, WASP, you know, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant?
Yeah.
Isn't that also the onset of white supremacy? You know, could also be beginning at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I think white supremacy, I don't know. That's a good point. I think of white supremacy as being around much longer.
Yeah.
But it is being taken and it's being validated that this is good. This is good for everybody.
Hmm.
Um,
What about Catholicism? That played a big role in white
Catholic,
supremacy. You know?
yeah, well, Catholicism is a real problem here in the United States that, in fact, it's one reason that we think it's okay to go to war against Spain, because Spain has taken the wrong religion to these people.
Yeah.
And even in, when you start getting into, like in the 1920s, when the Ku Klux Klan resurges, half of the reason is because all these people are joining it because they're against immigrants who are Catholics and Jews. So it's the wrong religion. And I don't think Protestants at the time even see them as Christian.
Yeah.
I wanted to just say a couple of things. Number one, I thought it was so fascinating that just when you started talking about people who have a feeling of innate natural superiority over all other beings, Elis Cat showed up. So, that was the purpose. I also just want to say that you did just an outstanding job, and I'm definitely going to steal some of it.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that, man.
Robin just called out her agreement.
Oh, man. Let me tell you, to get validated by Troy, that's a big deal. Thank you. I'm honored. You can steal all you want. I'll email it to you.
Well, you certainly did do a good job, and boy, this is really very educational. Thanks.
Hey, Troy, I don't know if you heard, Hi brought up something, and I'm just not sure about it. If this was kind of the real beginning of white supremacy, but just off the cuff, I was thinking white supremacy had been around much longer, but it's almost like we turn it into, well, yes, this is a really good thing, and we validate that, yeah, white supremacy is good because look at what we're doing for other people. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, white supremacy had been around for a long time. And a lot of the antecedents to this stuff that you talked about was the beginning of scientific racism, which was here in the 19th century, which was a way to justify slavery, really.
Right.
And so all this pseudoscience was being used to justify what people wanted to do ultimately for economic reasons.
Yes.
And so here is when we start to see it being codified in foreign policy.
Yep.
United States. Never, other than, the war with Mexico, there had not been a lot of this white supremacy extending beyond the borders. And I don't want to get ahead. We're going to talk about Frederick Jackson Turner.
No, we're not, but I'd love for you to talk about that.
Well, I'll just mention it briefly. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Frederick Jackson Turner. He was a historian in the 1890s who did something that no other historian had ever done and has never done since. He gave a talk at a conference and more than 3 people remembered it. All about westward expansion. It was called the Frontier Thesis. And basically he argued that from the beginning, when the English colonies were established, that the American character was built by continually going farther westward. You can just go a little farther west, and if you can take land away from the natives, then you can, make something of yourself. Mm-hmm. As of 1890, the census showed there was no more frontier in the contiguous, Alaska was a territory that they had bought, but so far as, anyway, there was no more frontier. There was no more area that was that sparsely settled. And so in his paper, he was asking, what are we going to do now if that's how we've defined ourselves? And it is not an accident that within a couple of years, by the mid 1890s, late 1890s, basically the US government figured out, even though we've reached the ocean, we can still keep going.
Yep.
Which is exactly what Jeanne is talking about here.
And what determined with Frederick Jackson Turner, it was something about the census population or something per square mile of people?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, what defined the frontier? And that
I
there was,
don't remember what the number was, but
yeah,
Just a, kind of a quick question slash thought here, because I noticed a lot of the conversation from the stuff that I was able to hear. Sorry, my child and or dog needed a bunch of things like right in the middle there. But yeah, so we went back about what, the 1840s or so. Because when we're talking like right now, we're talking a little bit about like late 1890s, you know,
Yeah.
Troy had mentioned the war with Mexico were about 1846. Is that about where you were starting?
right. Yeah, that was some good backup to it.
Okay.
Yeah,
So, because I think it's interesting to kind of answer a little bit more into High's question, and then to kind of like, I think you made a good point where you were talking about how, oh, is my audio low? Sorry, is that better? Can people hear
Yeah.
me better?
that's good.
Okay, so when you talk about how far back does white supremacy go, the answer is, I mean, the short answer is all the way, right? But when you look at it from an American's perspective, right, our political history is built a lot on the writings of people like John Locke, and some of these types where John Locke basically writes a whole bunch of, you know, kind of just like wacky, not fully white supremacist, but pretty much, you know, like that thing like you were talking about earlier, the Anglo-Saxons destined for this by God for blah 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 whatever reasons, right? He also kind of tying into Christianity, Catholicism there, writes this treatise called On the Reasonableness of Christianity, right? Is kind of that America would later use as its justification for things like the Trail of Tears and a lot of these really heavy-handed pushes to Christianize indigenous populations, because in that, you know, John Locke argues that basically if you just look at all things being equal, Christianity is clearly the most reasonable of all the religions. It just absolutely makes the most sense, like, you know, so any reasonable person's just going to accept it. So you don't need so it's okay to have separation of church and state, which is one of those founding principles that we adopted, because everybody's just going to be Christian anyways. And so when we instituted that separation of church and state, and then not everybody became Christian, kind of like in that expectation, right? There was this like, well, wait a minute moment. And so you see this kind of push to being like, well, how do we really aggressively make everyone Christian so this doesn't become a problem later? And so there's a lot of that kind of white supremacy baked into just, I mean, Christianity and Catholicism that goes all the way back to, you know, pre-Aquinas, right? But yeah, I think it's interesting because from a political theory perspective, right, people like Edmund Burke, who argued tradition for tradition's sake, right? Have a good one, Troy. You know, which was again one of those kind of defining political theorists that America really like latched onto in the middle 19th and early 20th centuries, when especially as the you know, the union movements and all these types of things in the Industrial Revolution, and then as we went in towards things like the New Deal, Edmund Burke's name started showing up even more of like, well, hold on, we have all these traditions, like we can't just throw these away. These are important. We've had them for, well, since the beginning, right? And you know, the idea that, well, no, these are all like dumb and racist didn't matter. It's like, no, but they're tradition, and tradition in of itself is good, right? So I think so my question after all of that synopsis is, how much of a role do you think that kind of forced uneducation, right, like that the founding fathers took on only focusing on, like, say, writings like John Locke and some of these others, and not like his contemporaries like David Hume, who was aggressively anti-Locke, right? He was very almost communist to some degree, absolutely didn't believe in race theory, you know, argued for, you know, equal treatment of all people of color types, you know, across the board. So what is it that you think about going back through this, like, led us to lock onto John Locke and Edmund Burke as opposed to people like David Hume or some of these others?
Wow. I don't know because I'm not familiar with some of these others. But I know with Locke, let me take that back. I know like with our founders, you know, the writers of our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, that's what I'm thinking. You know, you see the elements of Locke in those. And I think there was no question that, you know, when they talk about man, well, man is white. I mean, there was no question that this whole thing, you know, much of which is kind of based on some of Locke's writings, they don't have to define man because it's just assumed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of that general premise that you had talked about earlier is that, you know, the racism is really just baked in
It's baked
from the
in.
foundation, right? Like the whole foundation is corrupt all the way to the core.
Exactly.
And
you know, too, I just thought of this, you know, because within the Constitution, I mean, it more or less, you know, says, well, slavery's there, you know, the word isn't there, but 3/5 of a person is there for the purpose of for the purpose of white representation.
Sure.
In the Congress and in the Declaration of Independence, I mean, it's just written in, Indians are merciless savages. They were, you know, so these
that's what I was going to say is that, you know, we utilize the language of savage when it referring to indigenous people, which again, you know, there's, you know, from an imperialistic propaganda position, right? Like there's a lot of value there and that, like, you know, if they're savages, right, then it's good to conquer them. It's good to, you know, turn them into noble, whatever, right? Which is, I mean, to be fair, which is exactly the position that Rome took as it expanded northward into what they deemed the barbarian lands, right? Like it was, you know, in the first and second centuries, you know, Rome made a massive push into what's now things like England and then the Nordic countries, right? Because they were barbarians. They're just filthy woodland savages up there, right? And so it's like we need to go and bring them our culture and our gods and our things that actually are real and matter and not their goofy make-believe whatever. And so Rome marched the armies north and conquered a big chunk of that land, all under that guise of, you know, bringing, I guess, culture to the people, right? And so that's, I think it is a historically European thing to do. That dates, I mean, way back to the beginning.
I think it
right? So
maybe go even further back than that because
sure. I mean, Greece was notorious for it.
Yeah.
You know, the Greeks were all about just conquering everything in their path.
In war, your opponent is dehumanized, and that's part of this. But I think racism is maybe a real special case. Howard Zinn made the case that racism came along with slavery because the slave owners didn't want their indentured servants making common cause with the slaves. And that was in colonial times.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Well, you know, coming back more forward than colonial times, but when we go to the founding, the Naturalization Act of 1790 specified that only whites could naturalize to become citizen of the United States. You know, so we identify as a white nation. I mean, you know, you don't even have to hear, it doesn't have to be always talked about or said. We just identify as a white nation until 1868, because nobody else can be a citizen. Then in 1868, with the 14th Amendment, two things change. The first is if you are born here in the United States, you are a US citizen, and it extended citizenship to those of African descent. to allow African Americans to be citizens. Okay, so all the way up and, from our founding until, 1790 to 1868, you got to be white to be a citizen. After 1868, you got to be Black or born here. So a Chinese immigrant can never naturalize, but a child born to that person here in the United States is a US citizen. And I don't think we thought about that. We saw some issues there.
I think that they did think about it. I think that was absolutely strategic.
You do?
Because you have a situation where it forces generations over time to abandon the homeland, abandon the culture, and it forces a sterilization into strictly American culture, right? Especially when you look at, say, Chinese immigrants, right? It's still even common today that there are long-standing ties back to family, back to China, back to the mainland that the United States has always tried to break. And so originally the idea is look, if we can get your kids, they're Americans, right? And then their kids will be Americans. And so we're looking at maybe a generation or two down the road, great grandma's going to come by or grandma's going to come by and say, hey, let's talk about homeland and China. And maybe we can go visit and blah, blah, blah. And they're going to be like, I don't care about that. I'm American. I'm not Chinese. And by creating that separation, you can start to, it's more that kind of it gives you more wiggle room on some of your imperialism that you're intending to do, right? Because now it's hey, let's say, you're from Singapore or whatever, and we decide we want to conquer it. Well, if your grandkids, they don't care about Singapore at all, they're not connected to it in any way. They're just as likely going to enlist in the armed services to go and help us conquer the homeland as any random other person, right? That we can rope in. So just kind of you reduce a lot of resistance strategically by creating those hard lines in the sand. That's my interpretation of it.
And of course we tried to, even after that, we just tried to stop all Chinese and then all Asian from even coming into the country and just totally banned them. So I think we thought that would help get rid of that problem, but it never did.
Not until we realized that we needed them to build railroads. And then
this is after is after they built the railroads. Then we're going to kick them out, never let them back in. Yeah, exactly. Well, I've enjoyed tonight. This has been pretty good.
I appreciate you doing the class, and I look forward to next week's. I will make sure that's marked better on my calendar so I don't miss the first 10 minutes, and then we're looking forward to it.
All right, good deal. All right, sounds good.